Welcome to a new video and a new camera comparison about some very interesting Xiaomi phones. The Xiaomi 11T against the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10 Pro. One of the best mid-range camera phones that came out last year and is still very good. What makes them so interesting in terms of cameras? Let's get started. So let's take a look at those two phones here and their camera sensors. What is so interesting about them? It is simply they have basically the same setup of cameras. The same ultra-wide angle 8 megapixel camera. I think just the Redmi has a smaller field of view, 118 instead of 120 degrees. And the rest is basically the same. The main sensor is the same. Granted, the Xiaomi 11T has f1.8 aperture and the Redmi Note 10 Pro an f1.9 aperture, but everything else is the same sensor behind this glass or plastic in this case on both, and they also have a 5 megapixel autofocus tele macro camera, which is pretty awesome. The only thing that the 11T is missing is a 2 megapixel depth sensor, which is not really usable or useful for the Redmi anyway. So then the biggest difference between those both is the processor, the CPU. When it comes to cameras, we have a MediaTek on the 11T and we have the Snapdragon 732G on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, which is also pretty interesting, I would say. So how do they compare? Let's start with some videos. So this is the front-facing video on the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10 Pro, external microphone clipped in, and this one can only do 1080p 30 frames per second, so it is stabilized, which is pretty good. It's cropping in a little bit, but I think for vlogging it is still okay-ish. Dynamic range should be okay as well. Let's turn a little bit to the sun there. It's burning a little bit out, but this is the Redmi Note 10 Pro's selfie video. And this is now the Xiaomi 11T with, I think it has the same kind of front sensor. Also can only do 1080p 30 frames per second, which is some kind of illness with Xiaomi phones and some other Chinese brands that can only do 30 frames per second. But what I can see here directly is, even if I turn a little bit here, is I think it has more high dynamic range, at least on the screen. If it ends up on the video is another thing. Stabilization should be good enough as well. Not on the screen, but I think the results should be good. What do you think about this one? I have the feeling it's not cropping in so much. I have the feeling this might be a better vlogging cam on the Xiaomi 11T, but you can tell me what you think about the 11T's front-facing video. This is the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10 Pro's main sensor, 4K 30 frames per second, the maximum it can do. But as you might see already, it is unstabilized. So if I move normally, it is pretty shaky and not very usable for a vlog. The thing that you have to do is you have to go down to 1080p 30 frames per second to get it stabilized. And with 1080p 30 frames per second, you get good stabilization. I think the high dynamic range should be okay as well. At least you should see a little bit of clouds and blue in the background. And I think also that the background blur, the bokeh, should be nice here on the main sensor as well, because it has the same large sensor size, 1/1.5, 2-inch size, the same as on the Xiaomi 11T. Let's check out the Xiaomi 11T. Now we have one very major advantage on the Xiaomi 11T, and this is 4K 30 is stabilized on the main camera sensor, which is pretty nice indeed. And the main camera sensor is the only one who can record 4K, because the ultra wide angle can only do the 1080p. So what do you think about this 4K 30 frames per second stabilized on the Xiaomi 11T? This is now the ultra-wide angle on the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10 Pro, 8 megapixels, only 1080p, 30 frames per second maximum on this ultra-wide angle. And I would really like to have 60 frames per second on this one. I think the sensor should be able to do this, but maybe the processor is not able to do this. What do you think about this 8 megapixel sensor? For vlogging it might be very interesting. I think I have to move my hand out of the way, otherwise you see it, because it's a pretty wide angle, 116 degrees I think, 118 degrees, something like this, 180 degrees I think it is, which is pretty wide. And how's the quality here? There's no focusing on this lens at all, and yeah, stabilization is all digital. And we have the Xiaomi 11T's ultra wide angle, also 8 megapixel, and this one also is the same sensor probably, because it's also only limited to 1080p 30 frames per second, no 60 frames per second, no 4K obviously. But yeah, it's a bit of a bummer, I would say, on the 11T. They could have gone with a 12 megapixel sensor here, or with an 8 megapixel sensor with faster readouts, so you can do at least 60 frames per second. The processor is capable of doing this. Otherwise, how stabilization, how are colors here, how's the wide angle? It should be a little bit wider than on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, because it's 120 degrees here on the super wide angle on the Xiaomi 11T. Here we have the photos. Redmi Note 10 Pro always on the left, and the 11T always on the right. So on first glance what we will see is we have a brighter exposure slightly, and it seems to be like a better kind of high dynamic range on the 11T. At least the shadows are not so as dark as on the Redmi Note 10 Pro. We're using the main lens here, and the rest of the clouds I think the same, so we don't have so much darkness in the clouds on the 11T as you can see here on the Note 10 Pro. And when we go in and take a look at sharpness, what we can see here is the Note 10 looks a bit sharper. So we can clearly see the text here. It is probably a little bit over sharpened as well, and here it's a little bit soft. When we zoom into the building itself, we still have the better sharpness on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, which is interesting, and we see also a little bit more of yellowish kind of tone on the 11T. This might be due to the processor and processing, because we have a Snapdragon on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, even if it's a Snapdragon 732G, and on the 11T we have a MediaTek Dimensity 1200. So this has a different processor and processes colors a little bit different, but also the sharpness is like a difference here. I took other shots here with the ultra wide angle to compare what kind of shot I get here, and on the 11T for some reason with the ultra wide angle, and I checked again the lens if there's like a spot. You can see like it's getting like if there's like dirt or something like this on this here, very bright spot here, and I noticed this also on other shots. But what we can see is here it's a very consistent shot. From here to here not much changes. From here to here you can see a little bit of change. It's getting a bit darker, and you can see it here also in the sky that it's getting a bit more blue, and here I don't think the color shift is not so great. Let's take a look at the details here. And detail level again, Redmi Note 10 Pro seems to be sharper. Could be that there's a lot more sharpening applied. When you take a look at the HDR, high dynamic range, we only see like the difference in color, but the rest I think is pretty much the same. Maybe slight edge on the Redmi Note 10 Pro if you take a look at the clouds here, which are a little overblown here. 8 megapixel ultra wide angle. The 11T has 120 degrees, the Note 10 Pro 118 degrees, so should be almost the same. When we take a look at the detail level, however, the brighter image here shows a little bit more details on the 11T on this little tower here, and the sharpness and sharpening applied on the Redmi Note 10 Pro is doing its job, as you can clearly see that this banner here is a lot sharper than here. And the brickwork, do we see more detail? I think it is pretty much on par, a little bit more smudged out on the 11T maybe, and a little bit more sharpened on the Redmi Note 10 Pro. This is why it looks a little bit sharper there. When we take a look at the zoom shot here, what we can see is, interestingly enough, that this is brightening up a little bit on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, because it's using the main sensor, both using the main sensor to zoom in. And here we have an interesting effect on the 11T. It's getting more contrast into the picture.
When we take a look at the picture itself, we can see that both are a little bit pixelated, but we have a little bit more yellowish kind of tone to it because it's like basically zooming in. And when we take a look at the banner here again and the text, what we can see is like there is over sharpening going on the Redmi Note 10 Pro clearly, and it's not so much on the 11T, so it keeps a little bit the image a little bit softer but more realistic in this case. And yeah, you have to decide what you like better, the over sharpened look on the Redmi Note 10 Pro or the more natural kind of look on the 11T. In terms of details, yeah, the sharpness is adding a little bit, but all in all, I more tend towards going to the 11T, just simply because I can add the sharpness that the Redmi Note 10 Pro has, but I cannot take away the sharpness that the Redmi Note 10 Pro does. Take a look at the letter here. It's just simply overdoing it with sharpness, I would say. Next shot, close-up shot, and yeah, we have a close-up shot here of a flower. Let's take a look at both here, zooming in. I really have to say, even with pixel peeping, I don't see much of a difference. Colors are the same, maybe a little bit more punchy on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, the yellow here, and a bit more flat on the 11T, but the detail level, maybe a bit more contrast on the Redmi Note 10 Pro. We know that the Note 10 Pro adds a little bit more artificial sharpening, so there might be a little bit more sharpness there, but it's pretty much the same, and the same goes for the background blur, as it's using the same sensor basically, so there is no difference in this kind of shot. In this kind of shot, it's very interesting because you can see that the 11T again has a brighter shot and now has a little bit more punch to the color, I would say. You can see the sky is a little bit more blue than this grayish kind of clouds here. When we zoom in, what we can see is also that I think there's a bit more detail on the 11T. It's not only brighter exposure, but maybe it's doing a little bit more sharpening, and the Redmi Note 10 Pro's branches here look a little bit softer, a little more realistic, and here it looks a little bit on the 11T more overdone in terms of sharpness, especially here in this area if you compare it to here, and a bit artificial on the 11T, I have to say. Which the Redmi Note 10 Pro is not doing here, and yeah, there's clearly the 11T is doing some sharpness here. We take a look at the picture here and the information in the tree. It's not only doing over sharpening, but maybe it has slightly better resolution in terms of details that you can see here. But I have to say it's the same story as before. I think the 11T is doing too much over sharpness here. So it flipped its coin. In this case, the Redmi Note 10 Pro did it more soft, and I like the Redmi Note 10 Pro a little bit better because I can add the sharpness if I want to. In terms of exposure, I think I like the 11T a bit better here. The Note 10 Pro is a bit too dark for my taste. Let's take a look at the main lens. This was the ultra-wide angle, and in terms of the main lens, we have a similar picture, but you see the difference here from the ultra-wide angle, which is very dark, to the main lens here. It's a different exposure kind of, and we have a warmer picture again on the 11T. It tends to warm up things a lot. When we take a look at the resolution of the image itself and details here, besides being a bit warmer, and yeah, I don't see much of a difference, I have to say. There is almost no difference. It's the same kind of sharpness, and yeah, maybe slightly the 11T has a bit more clarity here in the window reflection. You can see that it looks a little bit unsharp here already, where here it's a bit more clear, and it's very close, I have to say. And yeah, take a look at the leaves here and there, and then we go to our tree and take a look at the details that we can see in the tree. And here you can see it is identical. It is almost identical. There's not much of a difference. Here in this lamp, you can see a bit more clarity on the 11T, which is missing on the Redmi Note 10 Pro. But it's very close to those two. Now a zoom test here. This is the main lens, and I wanted to zoom in on this here. This is, I think, already 2x zoom. And what we can see here, clarity, but also sharpness and sharpening applied on the 11T gives you a bit better resolution here already. on this little sign, and the same goes for the background, the car, for example. Let's go and zoom in 5 times, which looks like this. And on first glance, the Redmi Note 10 Pro is a bit brighter for some reason. I don't know why it is brighter. It was a bit darker there. When we take a look at the image itself here, again, more clarity, better readability for the 11T. Just look at the text at the bottom, unreadable on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, and it's still readable if you know the language on the 11T. So the 11T in terms of zoomability has a better shot. Just take a look at the car here. You can clearly read the license plate here, which is not possible in Redmi Note 10 Pro. And also this here, the details are better on the 11T, which is interesting in terms of zoom. Then we have zoom in, 10 times zoom. Also again, the same story. The Redmi Note 10 Pro is beaten by the 11T. Just simply the processing ISP is probably better on the 11T. So even though the Redmi Note 10 Pro is very interesting and very good in terms of zoomability already, I tested it with others, it is clearly beaten by the 11T here, just having the better processor because the sensor is the same. Low light capability is also very interesting. The Redmi Note 10 Pro in its auto mode is kicking in some night mode, I think it is, because it has had a longer exposure time before taking the picture. This is why it's brighter here. The 11T just took the picture directly, immediately, without anything. This is very dark here. I couldn't read anything here on this model, for example. It was so dark, and both doing a good job in this very dark situation. When we zoom in, what we can see here is, yeah, it looks a little bit less clear on the Redmi Note 10 Pro, and here maybe a little bit more clear, but you can tell me what you think, which one is clearer. Maybe the 11T has some sharpening applied here, which makes it a little bit sharper. With the 11T I can also go into night mode specifically, and then I get something very similar to the Redmi Note 10 Pro. This is why I think the Redmi Note 10 Pro is using night mode here in this shot by default, but here again the same kind of thing, a little bit more sharp, and I think it might be sharpness applied. It might be also better processing for the night mode when it comes to putting one image over another and then stitching them together. Then also night mode applied on the Redmi Note 10 Pro specifically. You can see it gets a bit more yellowish. Here it was a bit more cooled down. If I go to night mode applied, it gets more yellowish for some reason, and when I go in here, you can see the sharpness level didn't really improve. Actually, it got worse for some reason. So then we come to the next one, which is both night mode applied, and again the Redmi Note 10 Pro, whenever I apply night mode, it has some kind of yellowish tint. The 11T doesn't have this issue, doesn't suffer from this issue, and on first glance, both in terms of brightness and detail level, okay. When I zoom in, you can see there is a bit of noise going on, fairly noise on the 11T that you can spot with your eyes. On the Redmi Note 10 Pro, you don't spot this noise so much because it has heavily applied filter for anti-noise filter, basically, which smudges out the background, where you can see a little bit of the wallpaper here, a little bit, which is uneven, and here it looks a little bit more whitish. And in general, when it comes to other detail levels here, I think they are on par, maybe slightly a bit sharper here because the 11T keeps a little bit more of noise, which makes it a little bit sharper. With the Redmi Note 10 Pro has more noise reduction applied here to this image. So this is that. When we take a look at the colors and color signs, do we see much of a difference in terms of colors? So let's take a look at not sharpness but colors here. I think it is a bit punchier on the 11T, but slightly, ever so slightly punchier on the 11T in general. But this is really hard to tell, and yeah, it's basically the same color saturation, maybe a little bit more on the 11T. That might be due to the different ISP in the processor. This is a macro shot, and here surprisingly on first glance I like the Redmi Note 10 Pro a little bit better because I can see a little bit more. It's more details here. If I zoom in, it is still not very clear. I don't know why. Maybe it was too close on it. But I like the Redmi Note 10 Pro a little bit more, but otherwise it's like neck to neck when it comes to the sensor for macro, 5 megapixel macro sensor, telemacro lens sensor. basically the same. This is the shot without the telemacro with the main camera, nice background blur, brighter exposure on the 11T, a little bit darker exposure on the Note 10 Pro. I have to say the 11T, especially here with the background, looks a little bit more artificial, and the Note 10 Pro is a little bit more natural, I would say. When we take a look at the level of details here, you can also see that it seems to be sharp here, but here this stem-like thing on this flower is in focus on the Note 10 Pro. On the 11T it isn't. It's back focusing here, where this has a little bit more narrow field of view apparently, which I otherwise did not notice on those close-up shots, but you can clearly see it in this shot that the focus was slightly off and slightly different. So what do you think about those two in terms of performance? I think the Redmi Note 10 Pro is keeping up with the 11T, but the 11T, using the same sensor, different processor, can kick off a little bit better shots here and there, especially the ultra wide angle. I think the 11T has an edge already when it comes to, because it has probably also different lens in front of. When it comes to the main sensor, it is a give and take, and I had more shots that were a little bit better on the 11T, though sharpness on the 10 Pro tends to be a little bit better in this kind of situations. What I have to say is the Redmi Note 10 Pro is running MIUI 13 already, and 11T is running MIUI 12 still, so maybe with the version 13 update, the camera also improves a little bit on the 11T and then clearly beats the Redmi Note 10 Pro. Otherwise, I really have to say it's so close that spending more money on the 11T is not because it has a better camera system. It's just because you want to have a faster processor and 5G capability. That's basically everything that I can say in this kind of department. Cameras are very, very similar. So what do you think about those two cameras? Which one is really the winner here? Is it the 11T that is slightly better than the Redmi Note 10 Pro, but the Redmi Note 10 Pro is a lot cheaper? I think, in the end, they are both at the same level, and the Redmi Note 10 Pro is doing good. If the Redmi Note 10 Pro would have had the Dimensity 1200, we would have seen the same results probably as on the Xiaomi 11T. What do you think? Write it down in the comments. That's everything for the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Until the next time. Bye.